This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and today I'm joined by someone from across the network, a guide through some very mysterious and murky territories that I'm glad to have at my side. It's Zachary Fruhling. Hi, Zachary. How are you?
Hi, Duncan. Thanks so much. It's been quite a long time since you and I have podcasted together, but in calling me a guide, are you calling me Virgil or are you calling me Beatrice?
Or possibly Neelix. I mean, take it however you like.
Neelix. Okay, sure. I never thought of Neelix as a type of Virgil character.
Well, that was the thing that struck me. We've kind of spoiled for anyone listening what we're talking about, I think, if they're down with their, 13th century literature, or 14th century literature, possibly in this case. Anyway, we're talking about Dante, because I know that you are someone who not only is very keen on Star Trek Voyager, you have your own Star Trek Voyager podcast here on the network, but also someone who is very keen on Dante, because I think you did a Metatreks episode way back, probably, this must be like 3 years ago or something, talking about Dante. I failed completely to go back and listen to that again. So apologies, but I enjoyed it at the time. It was a very interesting topic, and I just thought it'd be great to have you on to talk a little bit about the Voyager episodes that kind of reference Dante one way or another, and how we can maybe look at how his works might relate to Voyager specifically, but also in some ways potentially to Star Trek more generally.
I'm so excited to talk about Dante. It's something I've been excited about since I first encountered it back in high school, maybe even before high school. I think I read the Inferno, and then we were supposed to read the Divine Comedy in my senior year of high school. And for me, it's interesting because it delves into the mythological. It delves into sort of grand epic themes. It delves into philosophy and theology and its literature, and it's all interwoven with this romantic story about Beatrice from Dante's autobiographical life. So it's a very complex topic, well beyond the scope of anything we would talk about on Metatreks.
He was writing almost the original, not quite crossover fiction, but, there's almost the kind of Dante extended universe there, isn't there? Insofar as you've got La Vita Nuova, which is all about this well, I'm going to say character Beatrice, because as I understand it, there's not very much evidence for whether this was a real person or not. But certainly as far as the written works are concerned, Beatrice was this woman that Dante was madly in love with, even though he, as far as I can see, never exchanged any words with her, or more than like a very brief kind of passing conversation. So she is the subject of his early book, La Vita Nuova, and then also, as you say, plays a very key role in the Divine Comedy as well. So she's kind of a recurring character.
Well, in a way, La Vita Nuova lays the groundwork for the Divine Comedy, and you can see some of the numerology that Dante develops in La Vita Nuova in his relationship with Beatrice, and he interweaving that with his own Christian theology and with what he did in the Divine Comedy. As I remember La Vita Nuova, and I didn't have time to reread the entire thing before we recorded, but Dante encounters Beatrice at 3 distinct periods in his life, 9 years apart, 9 years, 18 years, and 27 years. And the first time he becomes enamored with her when he's 9 years old. And at age 18, she essentially rejects him. And then at age 27, she dies. And she becomes the basis for his poetic work. And I always took La Vita Nuova to be more autobiographical. And I'm not a Dante scholar. I'm not a historian. I'm not a scholar of literature per se. I'm more of a philosopher. So I don't actually know this. You probably know more than I do. But I had always assumed this was largely autobiographical insofar as Dante comments on his poetry throughout La Vita Nuova. He basically says, here's a poem and now I'm going to explain what it means. And here's a poem and now I'm going to explain what it means throughout the entire La Vita Nuova. And then, like I said, that kind of lays the groundwork for some of the things he did with numbers and numerology in the Divine Comedy. It's an interesting question how to connect this to Star Trek. We could always talk about some of the romances in Star Trek, but I think that kind of misses the point. As I was thinking about how to connect La Vita Nuova to Star Trek, it occurred to me that the clearest example of Beatrice inside Star Trek is actually the Enterprise for Captain Kirk. The Enterprise is Kirk's Beatrice. Absolutely.
And the death of the Enterprise, losing the Enterprise is almost the worst thing that can possibly happen. I mean, you're right. I just, since we're on the subject of what we know about Beatrice, I mean, I haven't gone and researched this in great detail, I'm afraid. I don't know a huge amount about Dante's life. But on the first page of my copy of La Vita Nuova, there is a biographical note, and it includes the sentence, of Beatrice, the love of Dante's life and subject of the Vita Nuova, not much can be verified. So I think maybe that's the answer. She did not. I mean, it's basically, ironically, it's only because of Dante, who, she probably, by the sounds of it, was probably barely even aware of, that she has gone down in literary history one way or another. And of course, like many characters in Star Trek, she appears in one book, dies tragically, and then comes back from the dead. Well, she doesn't come back from the dead, but, comes back in a second, just when you thought we've heard the last of this character, here she is again in the Divine Comedy, which of course takes place, in the afterlife, essentially. So she is able to put in quite a significant appearance. I was thinking, should we have had a spoiler warning on this, that, this character dies tragically? Because I actually, reading La Vita Nuova first, was quite shocked when she died. I was slightly, I don't know how I hadn't absorbed that this was a key part of the story, but I actually was not expecting it at all. I thought this was all going to be about this lovely romantic story. And then suddenly she's dead about 2/3 of the way through. And I was like, oh, right. Okay. This was a funny turn. I think maybe we can say that, a book that was published more than 700 years ago, if you're tuning into a podcast on Dante, maybe you should have read it already. I don't know. But as I say, I hadn't read it until a couple of days ago. But it is very interesting. Yes, she is this very idealized character. I suppose for me, the fact that she is so idealized, to be honest, for me, a slightly ridiculous extent, certainly in La Vita Nuova, I actually found it much harder to go along with in some ways that book than the Divine Comedy. And I think part of it is because Dante is just so obsessionally devoted to this woman who he barely knows. There's something slightly strange about it. And also at some points it feels like it's slightly artificial. It's slightly kind of constructed because he says that I think the point that she rejects him is because he's been giving attention to other women. And he always has some reason. He sort of says, oh, well, I was only giving attention to other women so that no one knew how much I love Beatrice. And he always has these shield ladies, he calls them, who are like the women that he has these sort of phony relationships with, almost, so that people don't realize how in love he is with Beatrice. And you kind of think, really, this sounds like quite a convenient way of retelling this story when the other person is no longer around to dispute it.
It almost sounds like The Seducer's Diary by Kierkegaard.
Right. Okay.
In that sense.
But the fact that there's all this kind of numerology and so on as well, it sort of makes it feel like it has been very artfully constructed. And he is doing something, I think, quite interesting as a sort of piece of literature. He's taking these poems that he's supposedly written at various points over the previous years, and he's kind of knitting them into one into one book. I mean, just on the most kind of basic prosaic level, I suppose we should say the reason we're looking at these two works by Dante and Voyager is that they both crop up in two episodes of Voyager. La Vita Nuova at the very, very end of the episode Latent Witness, which is the episode when the Doctor is going through this kind of crisis. We discover that he had this crisis, I think about a year and a half before, when he had to, in a kind of triage situation, choose which of two patients to save. And he saved Harry Kim as opposed to this random kind of red shirt who we've never seen on the show before, but we're supposed to believe is really, a great friend to everyone and a lovely woman and so on. And so in the final scene of that episode, Janeway comes in to visit him because they're doing, the Doctor is kind of like someone who's suffered a breakdown, basically, and his friends are all taking turns to sit with him and just kind of help him get through it. And Janeway has brought a book with her, which is a copy of this book, La Vita Nuova. And she's reading it. I have to say, she doesn't give the greatest advert for it because she does fall asleep midway through.
What a boring book.
Through reading it. I know, exactly. And I have to say, I didn't entirely blame her in some ways. I mean, I found it more of a challenge, as I say. I think possibly partly because I can imagine it might be more of a wonderful work of literature in Italian than it is in the translation I was reading. I just felt like there was something kind of missing, whereas the Divine Comedy has a bit more plot. It's got more characterization. It's got more sort of vivid descriptions. It's got a lot more that translates very easily across languages. But anyway, and Janeway has this line to the Doctor. She says, "I'm reading this, and it's relevant to your situation." And then at the very end of the episode, the Doctor gives a fairly free translation of the first sentence, really, of La Vita Nuova. And I'm kind of curious to know what you think, because I think it's interesting. On the one hand, it's interesting that the writers of Voyager chose to put this poem in Janeway's hands, to say that this is what she's doing in her downtime, and then to say so specifically this is relevant to the Doctor. And I actually think it's slightly unclear in what way is it relevant. What is Janeway thinking exactly when she says that? If we're to sort of, because the episode kind of ends, it doesn't really ever answer exactly what is the link between this this work of, it's a mixture of poetry and prose, but she calls it a poem, and the Doctor's kind of sort of mental, psychological, moral, ethical crisis. I'm kind of curious, what do you have a kind of interpretation of what she means by that? Or is it a bit of a fudge on the part of the Voyager writers?
I don't. I actually think this is a bit of a fudge. It always struck me that line from La Vita Nuova, here begins a new life, is really tacked on. And I see what they're doing with Janeway and Dante. Janeway is stuck in the Delta Quadrant. She blames herself. She is very much like Dante at the beginning of the Divine Comedy. She's stuck in a dark wood in a way, and she needs, a guide home in a way. Maybe that's Neelix. I never thought of that. That's interesting. And of course, they keep referring back to Dante. We know, Janeway was given a copy of the Divine Comedy by her fiancé, so it's something that's emotionally relevant to her. So in that episode in particular, Latent Image, it feels to me like the Doctor is more in line with Dante at the beginning of the Divine Comedy. He's also stuck in a dark wood in some way. I don't really know why they chose to go with La Vita Nuova instead of something from the Divine Comedy itself. I think the connection to what's going on in the Doctor would be a lot clearer if it were something like the beginning of the Inferno. Best I can figure is that they just liked the line. It was an inspirational sounding line, and it was Dante, and they've been building this Dante theme with Janeway, so they went with that line. But no, I completely agree. I think it's a bit of a fudge, and it's kind of an ad hoc addition into what's going on with the Doctor. I think the connection with Dante in the broad sense is clear. The Doctor is having a moral crisis. He needs some guidance, needs to rediscover himself. Maybe Janeway is like Beatrice to the Doctor, but that seems like a really odd connection to me. I would really have to force that connection, I think, to make that hold up.
Or I suppose you could say that the fact that La Vita Nuova is partly about Dante dealing with the death of this idealized woman. Maybe there's something in that. Although really the story with the Doctor kind of hinges on the fact that although everyone thinks she's great, he says, I chose my friend. Harry is a friend of his, and she is just, it's kind of essentially a patient. So I'm not sure that quite makes sense. I mean, I have to say, my sort of feeling is it's a bit of a fudge. It's interesting to hear you say, why didn't they go for the Divine Comedy first? And that makes perfect sense, because if you think of Dante, that is the work that is the one that springs to mind, if you know what I mean. That's the kind of classic of world literature, the greatest Italian work of literature, as many people would claim. And yet they don't do that. And they don't mention, I mean, when you say, yes, she says in another episode that Mark gave her a copy of the Divine Comedy as an engagement gift, but that comes a season or so later, I think.
That's true.
So this is the first time that they've made this link between Janeway and Dante. The only thing that occurred to me is that they've made a link already between Janeway and Leonardo da Vinci, who of course, was significantly later, but again, this kind of Italian Renaissance, the kind of Renaissance figure, I suppose. And Dante is connected at least to what's known as the early Italian Renaissance, insofar, which is some period beforehand. We might think of him as a kind of medieval writer, but there's something about, I think, the way that he writes that he's seen as kind of anticipating almost this kind of cultural shift in a sense. So maybe there's a sort of link there that we've associated Janeway with these kind of Italian Renaissance men who have a kind of, I was going to say humanistic. It seems wrong to call Dante humanistic in that sense, because obviously he's so interested in religion and Christian, he's a very Christian writer in a sense, but that there is something about his kind of worldview that is quite, it has Star Trek values in it. It's quite compassionate. It's quite kind of, you can sort of see a link there. And it just made me wonder, is that partly what's going on, that we've got this kind of association somehow, whether consciously or unconsciously, between Janeway as this woman of the future and this kind of ancient Earth history at this moment of change and this moment of kind of new ideas and new approaches and new kind of these sort of trailblazers in a way that somehow she's linked to them.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. You can't really understand, I think, the fullness of the Divine Comedy without understanding the role Beatrice plays in Dante's life, which you really only get from La Vita Nuova. Within the Divine Comedy, Dante is guided by two different figures. He's first guided by Virgil through hell, through the Inferno, into some portion of the way up into purgatory. And at some point, Beatrice takes over as his guide through the rest of purgatory into paradise. A standard interpretation of Dante and his use of these two characters. And again, it's interesting to discuss whether this is the right interpretation, but Virgil in some sense symbolizes human reason for Dante. Rationality gets him through his troubles in the Inferno, gets him part of the way up through purgatory. But at some point, another character, another connotation has to take over. And Beatrice symbolizes for him, which is clear, I think, in La Vita Nuova, symbolizes divine love. So, it's romantic love in La Vita Nuova, but at some point there's this shift that takes place in his mind where Beatrice becomes not only the symbol of earthly romantic love, but the symbol of divine love, sent from the divine to guide him the rest of the way to paradise. Clearly Dante's on this cusp of the Renaissance. He has this largely theological worldview, but the Renaissance is about to burst forth. And I think that's clear in his juxtaposition of these two characters in the Divine Comedy. Like any theological or religious person would have to do, they have to ask what's the relationship between the divine and the human, or between, divine love or human reason, especially as it relates to salvation in the Christian worldview. And I think Dante's answer is clear, that human reason gets you part of the way, but at some point divine love has to take over. And that's the role Beatrice plays. How does that relate to Janeway? Definitely Janeway is lost. She needs a guide, either an explicit guide or I think just a metaphorical guide back home. She feels largely responsible. But I don't feel the connection to La Vita Nuova, other than the fact that, it has these romantic connotations for her because the Divine Comedy was given to her by her fiancé, Mark. I really struggle to make the connection with La Vita Nuova, but I'm really onto something. I feel like I'm onto something with this notion that the Enterprise is Beatrice for Kirk, because the biographical story kind of holds, right? Kirk, encounters the Enterprise, becomes enamored by the Enterprise, loses the Enterprise, maybe not rejection, but at a certain point he loses the Enterprise, regains the Enterprise, and then only to lose the Enterprise again when the Enterprise is destroyed. I love this idea that maybe Kirk is sitting later in life, before Star Trek Generations, is sitting there writing love poetry to the Enterprise, narrating it as he goes.
That's what he's doing in that kind of log cabin.
Captain's log. Here comes another poem about the Enterprise.
Well, I suppose I don't think La Vita Nuova necessarily has to relate to Janeway personally, though I was thinking in some ways when you say about, the idea of Virgil kind of handing over to Beatrice, it is almost, it did strike me when I was looking at the Divine Comedy that Neelix is the character that springs to mind, because he is very much, he's the local, he's the one who knows the territory, he is the guide. And then he reaches a point, just like Virgil, where Virgil sort of says, I can't go any further than this. This is as far as I can get to. And he sort of has to pass him over because his sort of geographical knowledge has run out. And you do get that with Neelix. I suppose with Voyager, in an odd way, you could say there's almost a link between the point where Neelix's sort of Delta Quadrant knowledge dies out, and then 7 of 9 turns up almost immediately. And you could say, I'm not to get into the whole strange world of Janeway 7 shippers and so on. And I don't think there's any sense really in which 7 of 9 is kind of leading Captain Janeway towards the Alpha Quadrant. But obviously 7 of 9 has qualities in common with Beatrice, I suppose, as this slightly idealized, feminized, slightly impossible woman, if you know what I mean. There is something of that. And obviously the Doctor, of course, as we find out at some point, is secretly in love with her, just as Dante is secretly in love with Beatrice. So, I don't know, who knows? Maybe there's some kind of a link there. And certainly in the episode Latent Image, it's Seven who plays the kind of key role of actually changing Janeway's mind. So, who knows? Maybe that was on someone's, maybe if only on Brannon Braga's mind or whoever it was at the time.
Well, I don't know.
Jerry Ryan had come on the show.
Too much credit here.
Possibly. I think, to be honest, I think a big part of it is really that the line at the end kind of works. It's one of these things where actually it maybe works better if you don't know the source material, because you assume it's more applicable than it actually is. Captain Janeway has said, this is relevant to your situation. Most people are going to say, oh, yeah, sure. She clearly knows what she's talking about. And then the Doctor has this line at the end, which is quite evocative and powerful and interesting. And it ends on this idea of a moment in someone's life where, here begins a new life, where this is a kind of a new starting point, and the idea of these chapters in life and the memory. And I suppose the whole episode is about the Doctor's memories and kind of reincorporating these memories of the past and so on. And I think in some ways that line allows what has become quite a bleak episode. And it always strikes me, it's very strange, at the end of this episode, other than him reading this one line of Dante, we basically leave the Doctor at the end of this episode in the midst of a pretty serious mental breakdown, basically, with no very clear indication that he's going to come out of it, because last time round he didn't. And yet, of course, next week, he's going to be back to normal and everything's fine. But so I think that line, exactly. Well, yeah, of course, there's the kind of, but the reset button here is not even in the episode. The reset button is just kind of somewhere in between, which is kind of strange that the episode ends on a kind of almost a cliffhanger, you could say in some ways. But it's kind of understood as not being a cliffhanger because he has this moment where he reads this, 700 more 1,000-year-old poem for him, or it's a piece of prose. I think that section that he reads, 1,000-year-old book for him, and seems to take something from it. And I suppose just that idea of here begins a new life kind of sets up the idea, okay, the Doctor is integrating these memories somehow. He's going to be able to kind of start moving forward. It sort of sounds hopeful in a kind of weird way. There is also an interesting question that I could not find, that as I say, what the Doctor says is quite a loose translation. It's not, as I understand it, what Dante wrote. And so the Voyager writers have, as far as I can see, paraphrased that quote. The difficulty is when you go online and you search for that quote, you get lots of people attributing it to Dante and lots of people attributing it to Voyager. And it's slightly unclear if there's a loose translation of Dante that the Doctor is actually quoting from there, then that's one thing. But I would like to know if any Dante experts are listening to this podcast and can identify that. I'd love to know, because I suspect that the Voyager writers just essentially rewrote this line to make it sound better and to make it sound more relevant to the episode they were writing. And now, if you look online, it's actually very hard to find has anyone actually translated Dante in that way or not. Is this just kind of a fake version, or does Star Trek take place in a parallel universe where Dante wrote a slightly different version of La Vita Nuova? I don't know.
I'd love to say I knew the answer. I've never actually tried to read it in the Italian, although I probably could. I took Latin enough where I could probably muddle my way through the Italian if I had to, but I've never taken the time to do it.
Well, it's the fact that I suppose part of it is that there's this line that the Doctor says, that something about the day that I first met you, and I don't think that is in the original, as far as I mean, I've only got an English translation in front of me, unfortunately, and what it says here is that this is how this is Mark Musa's translation. It says, in that part of the book of my memory before which there would be little to read is found a chapter heading which says, here begins a new life. The Doctor's version is much more kind of I don't have it in front of me, unfortunately, but it's much more kind of elaborate sounding in some ways, isn't it? So in the book, which is my memory, on the first page of the chapter, which is the day when I first met you, I think that's about right. Anyway, appear the words, here begins a new life, something like that. So the kind of basic idea is there, and most of the kind of words are there. But this idea of the day when I first met you, as far as I can see, is not in Dante's work. And he doesn't... La Vita Nuova is not addressed to Beatrice. It's it's written to a reader about Beatrice, if you know what I mean. So it's strange that someone would interpolate this idea of it being written to her, except that I suppose that makes it sound more romantic and it makes it sound more kind of personal somehow. Whereas actually, on the face of it, it's a slightly impersonal statement in a way, and I suppose that it doesn't really, that sentence on its own doesn't really tell you very much until you go on and kind of read the rest of the book and find out what's going on in it.
So I think it's interesting we have two competing interpretations of La Vita Nuova and maybe the Divine Comedy as it relates to Voyager. On the one hand, Janeway could be analogous to Dante, where Neelix begins as the Virgil figure. He's the guide through the first half of Voyager's journey. At a certain point, Neelix's knowledge of the Delta Quadrant fades away, and maybe 7 of 9 becomes Beatrice for Janeway in some non-romantic, except for the Janeway 7 shipper perspective that's out there. So that's one interpretation. The other interpretation might be that the Doctor is the Dante character, where in some sense, Janeway is the symbol of reason for him, especially in this episode, right? She's the one who talks him off the cliff, so to speak. But at a certain point, 7 of 9 becomes the embodiment of love for the Doctor. So in both cases, 7 of 9 is the Beatrice character either for Janeway or for the Doctor. I find that fascinating.
And it would be interesting to know, I actually can't remember off the top of my head who wrote the script for Latent Image, but I think this is at the time when Brannon Braga was kind of on board with Voyager, right? And was dating Jerry Ryan. I think, or certainly he went on to date Jerry Ryan. So there must have been some kind of something about Jerry Ryan. Anyway, I think you almost can't put those two things together without noticing some kind of a parallel between the way that 7 of 9 is represented by Voyager as much as how she's seen by any of the characters, but by Voyager, the TV show, and how Beatrice is represented by Dante in some ways. But it is, I don't think it's not one of those examples that you do get in Star Trek sometimes where there's a very sort of schematic, obvious, okay, we're doing this story and this person is playing this role and that person is playing that role. Like, for example, when DS9 does Cyrano de Bergerac, there's kind of certain roles in that story and they get kind of assigned to certain characters. I don't think that's what's really going on here. But it is interesting to think that, someone has obviously decided to bring this book into the Voyager story to associate this with Captain Janeway. And, who knows, maybe these kind of ideas are floating around at the back of someone's head or not. But I do think it's also interesting, this question of translation, because, as I say, of course, maybe that translation that Janeway's reading from is, a Vulcan translator's effort to, or whoever. Do you know what I mean? Like, so, like in Star Trek, you always have, these kind of imagined, our future, but their past
I'd like to read a
Vulcan
translation of Italian love poetry. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, although you could say, I mean, they say Shakespeare's best in the original Klingon. I can imagine the Klingons would have done a pretty good job of the Inferno. That would be kind of right.
Oh yeah, with Stavacor and everything. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. But there is this kind of interesting question about translation, I think. And it did cross my mind, what is Janeway reading? I mean, we sort of assume she's reading in English, but maybe not. Maybe she reads Italian because she seems quite into these Italian stories. B, is there a way, obviously with spoken language in Star Trek, everything is kind of simultaneously translated by the universal translator, but what does that do to written language? And interestingly, she's not reading it off a pad, because if she was reading it off a pad, you could imagine there could be some kind of, like the UT could have some way of representing the original language and the translation somehow together. It looks like she's reading an old, pretty old book, basically, that's been printed of it. But I suppose we have to kind of assume she's reading in English. But it did just strike me because reading these two works this week, La Vita Nuova on the one hand and the Divine Comedy on the other, I have to confess I didn't get all the way through the Divine Comedy. I read the Inferno and I listened to a rather good BBC radio adaptation of the whole thing. So I think I've got a kind of at least a sketchy outline in which David Warner plays Virgil. Fantastic, wonderful, sort of laconic Virgil. It was pretty good adaptation anyway. But it did just sort of make me think how much of it is, is there something that's lost in translation for me reading La Vita Nuova compared to someone who speaks Italian, who can read it in the original and kind of get the flavor of the language more in those poems in particular, because also it's a work. I mean, I think both these works being composed in Italian was quite a big statement at the time, and that's one of the reasons that Dante is seen as this kind of key cultural figure, because he wasn't writing. I mean, he did write in Latin to some extent, but these really key works he was writing in Italian, and that was kind of considered a pretty radical gesture in a way.
Do you happen to have a favorite translation of the Divine Comedy? I can't speak as much about this with La Vita Nuova. I've only read one version of it, and I don't even remember off the top of my head which translator it was. But for the Divine Comedy, I love the John Ciardi translation. I don't know which one you read, but I find that one captures the kind of poetic sense better than a lot of the English translations I've read. Even if it takes quite a bit of license with the literal translation, it tries to capture kind of this weird defective rhymes you get in Italian, and it has this kind of 3-line stanza approach where one stanza feeds into the next and just has this movement through the entire thing. That's the only one I have a hard time getting through other translations. I think it loses some of the momentum that I find in that first translation I ever read. And I actually have a confession to make. I have a really hard time getting all the way through the Divine Comedy. I find the Inferno riveting and part of Purgatorio riveting. And then at some point it just goes, okay, it just drags on and on and on once we get into the Paradiso.
Well, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? And I think, and that's one reason why, the Inferno is much more popular, I'd say, and much better known. And often, I mean, if you look at the translations that are out there, I mean, it is an interesting case because I think unlike La Vita Nuova, which is a bit, is not the great work of world literature or whatever, the Divine Comedy is translated over and over again. Great poets will translate it. So you do get these kind of interesting interpretations and translations, and so on. I mean, there's a translation, I think, that Longfellow did, for example.
Yeah.
Which is going to be very different to a modern translation or to I can't remember the name of the translator of the edition I read, but it felt quite modern. It felt quite, it felt poetic, but at the same time had a kind of slightly earthy, modern sensibility. It wasn't kind of frilly, old-fashioned poetry. Do you know what I mean? It felt like quite sort of up to date and kind of immediate, which I liked. It sort of it worked well for me, and it felt like it captured something. I don't know whether it captured the kind of style or the kind of texture of the original exactly, but it certainly seemed to fit the story well, and it fit the kind of descriptions, because that's part of what's so powerful about this poem, I think. And one reason, as I say, the Inferno is probably the most successful of the three parts, is these kind of horrific descriptions of, it's almost, at times, it is almost like a kind of Hieronymus Bosch painting of this kind of vision of these tortures being meted out to people, this kind of, I was going to say hellish environment. I mean, literally it's hell. So that's what it's going to be like. And it's very on Star Trek is the weird thing, that kind of, that vision of this kind of depraved, hideous, afterlife. Of course, you could say that Paradiso is more Star Trek. That's the kind of utopian, slightly, but arguably slightly bland. And maybe that's part of the problem and why it becomes slightly less gripping, because it doesn't have that kind of dark, gnarly texture. It doesn't have these kind of constant horrors being thrown in your face. I mean, the Inferno has a lot more sort of inherent drama almost, because it's also intense and kind of shocking.
And it's easy to forget how much is political commentary. He basically takes all the corrupt politicians and everyone he disagreed with about anything and put them in various circles of hell. So it's political commentary through and through. And so much of the politics of the day is lost on us unless you have, translators' footnotes or historians' notes along with it. It's easy to gloss over all of the actual historical references there are. I don't know. As I think about this, I kind of go, how does this relate to Star Trek? We do get corrupt politicians in Star Trek, right? We get admirals left and right. Politics in Star Trek is actually dirty business, especially in Deep Space Nine, to some extent to the Next Generation, but especially in Deep Space Nine and other iterations of Star Trek. It makes me think, like, if Dante were writing about Star Trek and that was his source material, where would he put all of the different admirals and which circle of hell? Overall in the Inferno, you get basically a theory of, I would call it retributive justice. As you sinned, to use the Christian vernacular, that's the way you're punished in hell, right? So it's very retributive. If you were, I'm struggling right now to think of an example from the Inferno, but if you were slothful, then you're stuck to the ground and you're moving in slow motion, right? That the way you were in real life is how you are punished inside hell in Dante's vision until you get into the Purgatorio and Paradiso. It is very anti-Star Trek. Star Trek is much more optimistic about human nature, I think, than Dante is, at least in the Inferno. But and I don't see much in the way of retributive justice inside Star Trek. Is there any attempt to punish people based on how bad they mess up inside the Federation? Or I don't know. Do alien species in Star Trek function this way? Is there a good analogy with this overall vision of punishment and retribution inside Star Trek? I couldn't think of one.
Not that really strikes me. I mean, it reminds me in some ways of almost, I don't know if you've read any of the books of Ian M. Banks, for example, who wrote a series of science fiction novels, which are often linked to Star Trek insofar as they do have this society, which is a kind of fairly utopian, sort of post-capitalist, post-scarcity, very laid back, kind of benign society. But then they always seem to be encountering these kind of other more backward kind of nasty, scary, freaky societies, which are sort of more like kind of the Earth of history, I suppose, where there is often that kind of, I suppose, sort of cruelty and suffering, and that kind of, almost sort of medieval mindset. I suppose that's part of it when we say, is Dante this kind of medieval poet or this kind of early Renaissance poet? There is something quite medieval about the descriptions of torture and misery and all of that stuff that's kind of going on there. I mean, it's interesting you say, is the Paradiso more kind of Star Trek? One way of looking at it might be, I mean, you say that Janeway's in the Dark Wood at the start of, throughout Voyager. I mean, that basically the first line of the Divine Comedy, the first line of the Inferno, is this line where Dante says he was midway, I'm paraphrasing again, but midway through the journey of my life, I found myself in a dark wood. So that's about right, isn't it? And I couldn't see the way forward. No way. Here you go. I'm giving my own translation just because I don't have the book in front of me. But something along those lines. Basically, at about the age, I guess, sort of in his mid-30s, maybe it seems to be how it's generally understood.
30s or 40s, midway through the journey.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Midlife
and those of us who are around that age can probably identify one way or another with, I've certainly had moments where I've felt like I was in a bit of a dark wood. And I think you could say, that's Janeway. You could certainly say in the episode Night, where we see Janeway dwelling on her past mistakes, or she sees it, the fact that she's got herself into this situation, struggling to literally see a way out of it. In that episode, there's this kind of spiritual sense. But equally, I mean, Voyager is transported to a dark wood, the Delta Quadrant. And the Delta Quadrant is literally, you know, the place that is not, and maybe the show never quite sells us on this. Maybe the show never quite makes the Delta Quadrant seem as dark and scary and freaky and alien as it should have done. But at least on paper, there's this sense that, okay, the Alpha Quadrant, we know that's where paradise is. I mean, literally Earth is described in DS9 as paradise, isn't it? The Delta Quadrant is like the opposite. It's all chaos. It's all gangs. It's all kind of brutal and shocking and scary. So maybe there is that sort of sense. There is that kind of sense of that. And the fact that it's an unknown quantity, almost in a very alien place. That is sort of what Dante's talking about in some ways in that opening. You know, he finds himself suddenly in this kind of alien place. And whether that means spiritually because he's in a bad state of mind, you know, really, and you read the whole thing as kind of allegorical, whether it means, you know, literally he's kind of transported into this wood where there are lions and wolves and kind of monsters everywhere.
Yeah, all of which are symbolic and metaphorical. Yeah.
All of which are metaphorical, but equally you could say, you know, in Voyager, that is almost, with the Kazon and the Vidians and all this sort of stuff in the early period of Voyager, they're kind of, is that sense of these threats from all sides and so on. And the fact that they're in this place that they aren't familiar with. When I was doing some research on this, I came across this phrase in an article about the Divine Comedy, and it said, and this tied in almost to what you were saying about giving up on the Paradiso at one point. It described it as an ultramundane journey, and I thought that's a very strange expression. I haven't heard that one before, because it makes it sound like it's going to be something really tedious and boring, right? It doesn't mean that at all. This is ultramundane in the sense of outside of the world, an otherworldly journey. And when I looked up that word, the gloss for it is existing outside the known world, the solar system, or the universe. And that, I suppose, is exactly what Voyager is it's a Star Trek story that exists outside of the known universe, more so than any other. I mean, you could say all of Star Trek is that, in that they're exploring and, you know, finding strange new worlds.
If they're on the frontier. Yeah.
But exactly, if they're on the frontier. But literally Voyager is the opposite, because they're thrown into this ultramundane situation, this kind of alien situation, and then the journey is kind of to get back. And that is, of course, the journey that you see in the Divine Comedy, is from starting off in the dark wood and then going through hell, then purgatory, then paradise. That's kind of the journey back to life for Dante in a way. It has to go in that direction.
It's also just, it's almost an Aristotelian summary of good drama, right? Drama has struggle, and then it has catharsis and, you know, some sort of resolution at the end. And, you know, the overall structure of the Divine Comedy has something like that Aristotelian notion of drama. I guess the connection, the reason I find it interesting is I've had periods of my life like that. You probably have too. And anyone who's, you know, deeper than a gnat probably has had a period of life where they feel like they're in a dark wood and they have to get out of it in some way. So for me, I look at the Divine Comedy as it relates to Star Trek, and I start going down the character list, like who in Star Trek has mostly been in the dark wood at some point or another. And I came up with a list, like who are the Dante characters who are alone in a dark wood at some point in Star Trek. I came up with Kirk inside Star Trek 2. You know, he feels lost. He's not captain of the Enterprise anymore. He feels old. He's midway through the journey. He's middle-aged in Star Trek 2.
And Khan, of course, has a copy of the Inferno on his bookshelf.
Yeah, exactly. It's an explicit connection.
And I suppose we might more associate that with Khan living in hell on that planet, you know, the fact that his heaven has been turned into hell. But I think Star Trek 2 is a film that definitely, you know, leans on that, because you also, of course, get the whole Genesis concept, which is basically Eden again. Mm-hmm. And that is in the Divine Comedy. It's in Eden that Beatrice kind of makes her appearance and kind of takes over at that point in the Garden of Eden. And you do have that whole thing in Star Trek 2 with, you know, maybe it's Carol Marcus in that instance in the Garden of Eden.
Well, maybe she is the Beatrice character. She really is for Kirk in some sense. I mean, she may not be the symbol of divine love. I'm not sure if Kirk really has that. Like I said, other than the Enterprise, we know the Enterprise is Kirk's first love. But she does kind of get him out of his dark wood in a way. You know, she makes him see things in a different way when they're talking in that little conversation. Before they enter the Genesis cave, when the rest of the crew leaves to go look at the Genesis cave and she and Kirk are sitting there, I think that's kind of a turning point for Kirk in the film. So I came up with Kirk, Janeway, of course. I'm going to go down this list. Let me know which of these you think is most compelling and which ones you find wildly off base. I would say Michael Burnham is a plausible Dante character. The Doctor we talked about. Chief O'Brien in Hard Time in Deep Space Nine, in that episode when he remembers 20 years of being in prison, which all happened in his mind. B'Elanna, also in Voyager in Extreme Risk, she's really lost her way. Also, it's interesting that Chakotay comes to her rescue in a very Virgil kind of way, and especially that Chakotay is the one who keeps bringing Dante up to Captain Janeway.
Well, Chakotay is always cast in that role. I think there are all those episodes where you usually get Chakotay kind of bending down on his knees and kind of relating to someone, and he is the spiritual guide. I mean, he's literally a spiritual guide to Janeway early on with her animal experience.
I didn't think about that.
We get that episode with the Doctor where he's the one. Projections, is that the name? The second season episode, and he has this really kind of impassioned speech towards the end saying, don't give up on your life. He does those speeches. He does it for B'Elanna again. He is sort of the go-to guy if you need a bit of spiritual support, a bit of kind of bolstering. Ironically, you don't go. He does the same for Neelix in Mortal Coil when Neelix is on the point of committing suicide. It's always, Chakotay is like the kind of Samaritans of Voyager. I think anyone who's in that kind of real dark situation, it's him who wanders in and turns it around. Not ironically, their morale officer. It's the first officer somehow who is able to make that kind of very sort of human connection with people and encourage them to, I suppose, have hope and not to despair almost. It does seem almost like a kind of Virgil character in that sense.
It's interesting because Robert Beltran wasn't happy with the way Chakotay was written. He thought he didn't have enough to do dramatically, essentially. He's always saying, yes, Captain, and, scurrying off the bridge. And I think Voyager fans recognize, his character didn't get the due that it deserves. But here, we're basically characterizing him as a Virgil/Beatrice character, I mean, if he's in company with Virgil and Beatrice, and that's the analogy we're making, they must have done something right with this character.
If only that they keep putting him in virtually the same scene over and over again.
Yeah, that's true.
So, they're like, yeah, okay, Robert can do that with his, hands behind his back.
How about Spock in the motion picture? He's really in a dark place at the beginning of the motion picture. He's not able to obtain his state of Kolinar, and in a way, he becomes some combination of Virgil and Beatrice. Obviously, Virgil. If Virgil symbolizes human reason, Spock has to be the Virgil character, right? He's the logical character, but he helps guide Kirk back to the Enterprise. and before Spock and McCoy, it's really before Spock comes on board, before Spock comes back on board in the motion picture, Kirk feels really lost, right? He doesn't feel at ease on the Enterprise. The Enterprise has changed around him. Spock isn't there. McCoy doesn't really want to be there. He's knocked Decker out of his chair, and he keeps flubbing. He causes the wormhole, so things aren't going right for Kirk until Spock shows back up and things start to gel again. So, Spock kind of plays this Virgil character for Kirk, I think. And if Spock is Virgil, McCoy must be something like Beatrice. It's the trifecta of Kirk and Spock and McCoy has to be Dante and, Virgil and Beatrice to some sense, Spock always saying, here's the logical, and McCoy saying, here's the emotional component of things. There's got to be some connection there. I'm not sure it's a very, very deep connection, but things don't really gel in that movie until Spock shows back up, I think, for Kirk. But Spock is lost at the beginning too. They're all lost at the beginning of the movie. McCoy doesn't want to be back. He's got his beard and his, porn star medallion. He doesn't want to be in Starfleet. He feels lost in some sense. Kirk definitely feels lost. Doesn't quite know how to function on the new Enterprise. Spock feels lost. He can't obtain Kolinar. It's when they come together that everything starts to gel. So maybe they're all playing those roles for each other in some sense. I also came up with Captain Pike in the cage. He feels really lost. He's in a kind of moral dark place. He's exhausted. He's tired of the burden of command, and he's literally
plagued by a vision of hell at one point, isn't he? I mean, there's that line that Talosian says, "Oh, a myth from your child you heard in childhood," or whatever, and that is seemingly a depiction of like the fires of hell. That's what Pike is thinking of, and obviously in Discovery they play on this and say that his father had some kind of religious background, so he has more of a kind of familiarity, at least maybe sympathy towards kind of Christian religious belief and so on, compared to other Star Trek characters that we've typically seen over the years. They sort of kind of make sense of that. But I mean, that is something that is right there from the very beginning of Star Trek with that character. There's that association of him, burning in the fires of hell like that.
So can you think of any other plausible Dante characters in Star Trek? In the sense of being lost in a dark wood at the beginning of the Divine Comedy.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I suppose depending on how broadly you take that, you could apply that to, you could probably apply it to all of the captains. And I think there is something about the kind of loneliness of command that ties into that. So, Picard has sort of moments like that. I mean, particularly say after the Best of Both Worlds, that kind of, we see them all pushed one way or another into a kind of crisis situation. I mean, Sisko has that point after Dax has died and he kind of goes back home and he seems very much lost, and he actually needs a prophet to come and take him by the hand and kind of very much in a kind of, well, not in a Beatrice like role because she's his mother, but very much in that kind of sense of this kind of otherworldly person to kind of guide him back to where he needs to be, to get him back onto Deep Space Nine. So you could certainly see that. I suppose Archer as well. You have the whole thing after the Xindi crisis. Similarly, finds himself in a kind of dark place. But whether there's something different between the dark wood as just a metaphor for feeling kind of lost and a bit hopeless and like you can't see the way out of your current predicament, which I think is absolutely what Janeway is going through in Night, and a sort of broader narrative thing where I think it is Voyager that is the series that kind of relates. Maybe it's not just so much Janeway is Dante in Voyager, but Voyager is Dante in Voyager. If you know Voyager the ship, because that's the situation they're all in. The whole ship is stuck in this dark, mysterious, scary situation. And are they going to be able to get back to the light? Are they going to be able to get back to paradise or not? But the other thing that struck me, actually, funnily enough, is not so much a Star Trek character that relates to Dante, but there's another character in the Divine Comedy who reminded me very much of some of the kind of Starfleet captains, and that's Ulysses. And Dante creates this very interesting story for Ulysses, which I don't think, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know that there is another source for this. I think this may actually be a story that he's kind of invented for him, or maybe it's a story that was known, but it's certainly not in. It's not in the Odyssey.
You'll have to refresh my memory. I can't remember the passage that you're calling to mind.
Well, he meets Ulysses, who is Odysseus, basically by his other name. And the story that he tells is that as in old age, he gathered his old crew back together for one final mission, and it was a disaster and they all died. And basically, there's this enormous guilt attached to him for feeling that, very much as Kirk is kind of constantly doing in the films, basically, that by getting these kind of old, fuddy-duddy guys back together who should be resting in retirement and not out, in the galaxy in their ship or whatever.
I think you just summarized Star Trek 4 through Star Trek 6, yeah. And maybe in Star Trek Picard.
Picard, again, absolutely. Although let's hope that it doesn't have as disastrous an impact as it did for Ulysses, because basically the way Dante tells it, this is what Ulysses is being punished for, essentially, is giving bad counsel, is kind of talking these old guys into this mission that really they had no place going on. They should be kind of enjoying their retirement. Essentially, they should not be gallivanting out, across the seas, or in the case of Star Trek, across the galaxy in a starship. Those days should be behind them. And basically what happens is it's a complete disaster, and I think they all die. And Ulysses has this kind of great guilt for the fact that he talked them into this mission that really none of them should have gone on in the first place. That very much, first of all, it seems like a very sort of Captain Kirk thing to do. And we do get that sense in the original series movies that he sort of keeps getting these,
get the band back together. Exactly. Yeah.
His old crew, but literally his old crew by that point, back together. Maybe we'll see that to some extent in Star Trek Picard as well. But also very much like Janeway in that episode Night. Again, a character who is kind of the captain who makes a call on behalf of his crew, but then kind of regrets that decision and wonders, have I led my crew into a terrible situation? Just as Janeway is kind of thinking, have I stranded my crew in the Delta Quadrant, without good cause almost, and created a kind of terrible situation for them in that way.
Well, the parallel to Ulysses or Odysseus is interesting because, like Dante, almost more literally, even though it's still mythology in the Odyssey, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but mainly the Odyssey, I'm thinking Odysseus or Ulysses is on a journey, 20-year journey home. So, maybe that's a better connection in terms of plot structure and, the overall storyline of Voyager than Dante is. I think of the Inferno and the Divine Comedy as largely metaphorical, maybe psychologically metaphorical, but the Odyssey is a literal journey home for Odysseus. I found an interesting translator's note from my copy of the Divine Comedy on Ulysses. So I'll go ahead and read it if you'll indulge me, and you can see if this makes any sense or not. But it's a note on Ulysses, and is it Diomede? Is that the right way to pronounce Diomede? Ulysses and Diomede. They suffer here for their joint guilt in counseling and carrying out many stratagems which Dante considered evil, though a narrator who was less passionately a partisan of the Trojans might have thought their actions justifiable methods of warfare. They are in one flame for their joint guilt, but the flame is divided, perhaps to symbolize the moral that men of evil must sooner or later come to a falling out, for there can be no lasting union except by virtue. Their first sin was the stratagem of the wooden horse, as a result of which Troy fell and Aeneas went forth to found the Roman line. The second evil occurred at Skyros. There Ulysses discovered Achilles in female disguise, hidden by his mother Thetis, so that he would not be taken off to the war. Didomia was in love with Achilles and had borne him a son. When Ulysses persuaded her lover to sail for Troy, she died of grief. The third count is Ulysses' theft of the sacred statue of Pallas from the Palladium. Upon the statue, it was believed, depended the fate of Troy. Its theft, therefore, would result in Troy's downfall.
Well, certainly you could see from the point of view of, someone who's on the side of Virgil is probably not going to be all that keen on Ulysses one way or another. But that's very interesting.
I'm a big fan of getting the band back together. I do this professionally. Anytime I can hire former coworkers and bring them back and get the band back together, I'm all about it. So I appreciate it. At a certain point, is it too much? Is it like, old rock stars getting back together? Is that awesome? Or does it become pathetic at a certain point? I think you can ask that about Kirk and maybe Picard and Star Trek Picard. When do you call it quits? What's the right time to bow out and realize that there is no more mission for you?
Is that the equivalent? Is the kind of slightly depressing cameo the equivalent of, Ulysses getting his whole crew into danger, kind of ruining what might have been? Because that is always kind of the fear, isn't it? That's why, famously DeForest Kelley and Leonard Nimoy didn't want to be in Generations, because they sort of felt they'd done their farewell and they weren't sure that this was going to add anything to it. And, is it always the right decision?
It's an interesting existential question, like recognizing the facticity of your own current state, your age, your situation in life, your circumstances, whatever, which are to some extent externally defined and not modifiable. They just are what they are, right? On the other hand, you can always use your free will to go do something different. You can go on another mission if you want to. You can get the band back together. You can fill in the blank. Life's still always full of possibilities, even when you're old. It's a really interesting, it's not a paradox, but it's an interesting juxtaposition of just the fact of the matter state of affairs and your power as a human being with free will to do what you want, getting the band back together or the crew back together or otherwise.
Well, it's interesting you should mention free will as well, because I suppose that's a key part of it. And I think there is a discussion at some point in the Divine Comedy about the importance of free will and the fact that, these people have made their own mistakes, because so much of it is about kind of accepting punishment for your mistakes and accepting the kind of quite harsh, in some ways, retributive justice that's being kind of meted out. And there is also this theme of kind of, it's right there in the opening line of not being able to see the way ahead, of needing a guide. The fact is that Dante needs a guide because he can't see his way out of the wood, let alone through hell, purgatory and paradise. There's nowhere he can see his way home without help. One of the things that kind of struck me is that when you get to the episode Shattered, which is the episode where we find out about this copy of the Divine Comedy, which Mark gave Kathryn as an engagement gift, which she then lent to Chakotay, because this is kind of the key thing, is he says, oh, you lent me your copy. And she being the Janeway of, whatever it is, 6 or 7 years earlier, is very skeptical and kind of says, my fiancé gave me that copy. There's no way I
wouldn't lend it to anyone. Yeah.
And especially not you, Marquis Captain. So it's kind of, a moment where the fact that Chakotay convinces her that she would do that, convinces her to trust him on some level, because it suggests they have this very close relationship. And she then even says at a later point in that episode, are we an item? Because she's kind of intuited something about their relationship that she would give this engagement gift to him to read. But then Chakotay says something which is kind of interesting, which is he says, I agree with Dante. This, again, I'm paraphrasing. Sorry. He says, basically, I agree with Dante. If you can always see the road ahead of you, it's not worth the trip. Now, this is almost the opposite of saying, we're in the Delta Quadrant, we need a guide, we need Neelix, we need someone to kind of tell us what's coming up. Actually, funnily enough, thinking of 7 of 9 as taking over that Neelix role, she does take over that Neelix role because with the benefit of all her Borg knowledge, she is actually the one person on the ship who sometimes does know what they're walking into in the latter seasons of Voyager, because she'll say, oh, this is species, blah, 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 or she will, have some kind of foreknowledge of what they might run into. So there is that kind of parallel there, maybe more so than we were thinking before. But it just strikes me that what Chakotay says is that he says, I agree with Dante. Sometimes it's better not to know what's in front of you. Now, I'm not convinced that Dante ever says that in the Divine Comedy. That is certainly not the meaning of that section that Chakotay is quoting. That he's not saying that at all. So again, it seems like this weird situation where the Voyager writers want to sort of appropriate Dante, but misrepresent him one way or another, or kind of misrepresent what he's saying, and just assume that the viewers will not notice, essentially. It's a strange example. And then when you look at that episode Shattered, again, you might think, well, what has this got to do with, why bring up the Divine Comedy here? The only thing that struck my mind about that episode is that you do have this kind of passing between not so much different realms of different spheres and so on, but different times. There is this kind of sense of Chakotay is this character who's kind of passing back and forth. And of course, he's guiding Janeway because he is the Virgil character who's almost, he's from the future. And in a sense, Virgil is not from Dante's future, he's from his past, but he is from his future in the sense that Dante is in hell and in the other places as a living person who doesn't yet deserve to be there. So he's actually in an analogous situation to Janeway in that episode in that respect, in that he's in the afterlife without yet being dead, just as she's in the Delta Quadrant without yet having been banished there, in a sense. So maybe there is a kind of strange connection between, in this case, maybe, again, it's Chakotay playing that Virgil character.
Well, this is an interesting segue into talking about a door or a gateway or the path ahead. Chakotay basically tells Janeway they're just some doors we don't walk through. And of course, in the Inferno, we have an explicit doorway. We have the gate of hell, right there towards the beginning of the Inferno. And I love the passage. It's one of the most memorable passages for me. And for people who haven't read the Inferno, I'm going to just read the little passage so we can talk about it and then see what connection there is to Star Trek here. I'm sure we can find at least a couple. But they were standing in front of the gate of hell, and the gate of hell essentially reads, I am the way into the city of woe. I am the way to a forsaken people. I am the way into eternal sorrow. Sacred justice moved my architect. I was raised here by divine omnipotence, primordial love, and ultimate intellect. Only those elements time cannot wear were made before me, and beyond time I stand. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. You know what? As I was reading this, it literally just came to my mind. I can't believe I didn't make this connection until now. This is the Guardian of Forever.
I was just thinking the exact same thing. Yeah, exactly.
I don't know how I never made that connection before.
It's strange, isn't it? And again, I suppose with the Guardian Forever, you've got time travel. And maybe there is a kind of weird link between Star Trek using time travel in a way that is almost analogous to this kind of mythic travel between realms. Do you know what I mean? In this, in kind of Dante's imagination, that there is a kind of link there. But absolutely, it certainly hadn't crossed my mind reading it either. But hearing you say those words out loud, that is the voice that kind of almost comes into your head, isn't it?
It is. It's the voice of the Guardian of Forever.
Whether that's intentional or not, who knows? But
with Voyager is, I think this is a really good connection. Voyager is standing before the gate of hell again and again and again. It's 7 of 9 saying, I know the way ahead, or Neelix saying, I know the way ahead. It's danger around every corner. It's the Kazon, or at a certain point, it's the Borg. And it literally is like, oh my God, if we go through this, rat's nest of Borg ships, we're all going to be assimilated, but we have to get through it. And, 7 of 9 and Janeway put their heads together and figure it out a lot of the time. I don't know what to say about this. I was also thinking a bit about the cosmology of the Divine Comedy. You've got this impassable doorway. You get through the doorway, you go through, this kind of forbidden place you're not allowed to be. You get through that and off you are into paradise at a certain point. It sounds to me a lot like the galactic barrier in Star Trek V. The galactic barrier being this impossibly dangerous place to go where angels fear to tread. And, somehow Cybok is leading Kirk and company on a journey through the gate, and they end up supposedly going to Shakari or the Vulcan version of paradise. that sounds structurally analogous to the cosmology of the Divine Comedy to me when put in those terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we do have parallels as well. I suppose the fact that Star Trek V places Zachary in a physical place, if you know what I mean. I mean, elsewhere in Star Trek, you might have references. I mean, I think there's the early Voyager episode, isn't there, where Harry Kim ends up with those people who they sort of displace their not quite dead, friends and relatives.
And end up on an asteroid somewhere. Yeah,
exactly. But there is this kind of weird resolution where there's some kind of energy reading or something that there's some kind of scientific indication that there might be a kind of an afterlife, or there might be something else beyond that. And interestingly, in the episode Living Witness, it struck me watching it today, Janeway has a line where she says that Ensign Jatal, who's the woman that the Doctor didn't save, is going on her new journey, basically going on another journey. So she's kind of explicitly implying, at least, and whether Janeway believes in that or not, I don't know. I sort of took it as maybe she's doing that out of respect for this person who's died's beliefs, possibly, or something like that. But it's, again, quite an un-Star Trek thing to say on one level, because it is, well, it's a sort of spiritual statement, I suppose, isn't it? However you look at it. So there is that kind of interesting element of that. And obviously, in the Paradiso, you get this sense, I mean, the Purgatorio, to me, it sort of felt like is more similar in some ways to the Inferno, in that it's a lot of people suffering, and maybe they're suffering. They describe the difference as being they're not just kind of going around in circles suffering eternally. They're kind of working through this process. It's almost like a kind of boot camp, or like Tuvok's Starfleet Academy training. It's like you're gonna really suffer, but at the end of it,
it's Aristotelian. You're getting all the bad things that trained out of you. That's exactly right. You're getting rid of all your bad habits, and
you're going to be purged, like Spock was purging his emotions. Exactly, and that's the kind of that's what purgatory is about, is purging this kind of. It's very much like what the Vulcans are doing, essentially, to sort of ascend to paradise. But then by the time you get to paradise, you do get they're literally traveling in space. I mean, they go to the moon, they go to the sun, they go to the various planets, the solar system. Do you know what I mean? So the spheres of heaven, as Dante sees it, understandably from a kind of without the benefit of kind of a modern astronomy and so on, that is kind of how you get up to heaven, essentially, is like the moon is a stepping stone along the way. So you do get this weird sense where they are almost in a sort of science fiction scenario where they're traveling to different bodies within our solar system.
I think that's compatible with Star Trek's techno-utopianism. The stars, in planets and the cosmology of everything in Star Trek is a gateway to sort of human idealism, right? We find the best versions of ourselves by being out there amongst those things.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose that's an interesting way of looking at it, I suppose. That the Earth is kind of, that's your starting point, but really things get better. There is that sense in Star Trek, isn't there, that maybe not all the way to the Delta Quadrant, but things get better when you get away from Earth. I mean, if you think of Captain Picard growing up on the Vineyard or whatever, for him to realise himself and to kind of have a fulfilling and interesting life and do great noble things requires him to get off of Earth. And in family, there's that temptation to take that job not only on Earth but underwater, and that's seen as the real threat to his kind of noble purpose. We can always
do that. I mean, at every dark period, like Dante in the Divine Comedy, in every dark period, you can keep pushing forward or you can tuck tail and run. And he's tempted to tuck tail and run. It takes Virgil coming to him and saying, no, we're going forward, no matter how scary it is. And I think at every stage in life, there's a tendency to go, oh, I better back off. I need to look backwards rather than looking forwards. That's like the worst thing you can do in life, right? I don't know. So you mentioned something about we were talking about the cosmology of the Divine Comedy, and you mentioned that you think it takes place primarily in the afterlife. And I found this really not clear at all, and I'm curious what your take on it is. I can imagine 3 different interpretations of what's going on inside the Divine Comedy. One is that it's a literal physical place, right? He's literally in a dark wood somewhere. Virgil comes along and there's a physical entryway into hell somewhere. It could be a dream state. He falls asleep one night and he, encounters Virgil in a dream, and all of the Divine Comedy is in some sort of dream state. Or it could be some sort of literal afterlife where most of the infernos, and maybe it's not Dante's afterlife. Maybe it's everyone else's afterlife. All the people in, hell and purgatory and paradise. Maybe it's a literal afterlife there. But you mentioned it takes place primarily in the afterlife. And I always pictured it maybe a little more in the sense of like a dream or a vision, something along the line of, John's vision in the book of Revelation or something like that, where it's, it's not literally in the afterlife, or is it? I don't know. What's the right way to read the Divine Comedy as a whole?
That is an interesting question. Do you take it? I took it fairly literally, but I take Star Trek literally, and I know that it's not real. Do you know what I mean? So I suppose, obviously, the narrator, Dante in quote marks, of the Divine Comedy, who may or may not be precisely the same as the real man Dante, who was putting quill to paper, is claiming that he went to all these places and met all these people and saw all these things. Obviously, we know that he didn't. If we're, broadly speaking, kind of rational, we don't genuinely believe that Dante was, literally beamed down to hell and guided around by Virgil. So I suppose there's a question like, on what level do you allegorically read the story? But to me, the story on its own terms, yeah, I did take it that this is what's happening in this story, we sort of accept. And whatever the reason for it, because I think it's Beatrice that has kind of kicked it all off, isn't it? There's this sense that Dante was metaphorically in a dark wood. He was in a very difficult time. He was in a state of despair, I think he says at one point. There's this sort of implication that he might have, because there's a lot of talk about suicides in the Inferno and so on, that he was kind of in a really seriously dark situation, and it's Beatrice who's kind of intervened, I think.
She sent Virgil.
She sends Virgil, very much like one of the prophets, in DS9, intervening in Sisko's life, and that somehow, almost like a kind of like a Christmas Carol for Scrooge, he gets his 3 ghosts, Dante gets his 3, realms, whatever you call them. That's going to somehow, he's going on a journey. He's going on his sort of his kind of hero's journey in a sense, and he's going to come out of it changed by seeing all of this and by the experience, and then he's going to go back to his real life and not be metaphorically in a dark wood anymore. So I suppose there's that kind of sense of it. So you could say, yeah, is it all to be understood as a vision? I think it's very tricky with that kind of allegorical writing, particularly from that kind of period, because you mentioned earlier on the kind of numerology and all these kind of structural aspects of it. The way that everything is kind of constructed and composed is very artful and very clever. It's almost like a kind of game in a sense. So it's very different to a sort of realist novel where you say, okay, this is as realistic, we take this as completely straight up. We believe everything that we're told. The narrator is just relating accurately exactly what happened, thing by thing by thing. But I suppose it's an interesting question. I thought you were going to say, when you say afterlife, it's a curious concept because we tend to think of the afterlife as something that happens after life. Obviously, it's like it's located in time for the individual as well as in place. Whereas the way Dante describes it, it's very much these are places, and not only are they places where there's a geography and there's a kind of journey. It's almost like, you think of something like Lord of the Rings, it's almost like a kind of, there is a kind of topography to it all, quite a lot of detail that he goes into. So it doesn't feel so much like what we might think of as an afterlife. As an afterlife is kind of where you go when you die in some sort of vague, wishy-washy sense. This sort of feels like an entire constructed place that you can visit and you can explore, and that, you have to know the route from A to B, and this bit you have to climb on the back of the weird monster, and this bit you have to go through this process in order to get to the next stage and so on. It does feel very it's not like when people say the afterlife and they think of heaven as this kind of cloudy sort of vague space, or a kind of dreamlike space where things just sort of magically, like in the Nexus is very kind of you walk out of one room and into somewhere completely different, and it's all a bit magical. This is a very unmagical, in that sense, afterlife, in that it feels very concrete, it feels very real. It's like another constructed world. It is like a sort of fantasy world almost.
Yeah, I guess that's the heart of my question. It feels so concrete that you could plausibly say that, Dante wakes up and he's, and doesn't know how he got there, but he's in a very physical place. He's not in a dreamlike state. He's in a wood, and it's got all these qualities that aren't ephemeral. They're tangible qualities. and the Inferno in particular feels very tangible and visceral and real. And there's like I said, there's a geography and a topography to it. I guess I don't have any real anything deep to say about this. I just always found it interesting that the kind of structural numerology that he develops in La Vita Nuova encountering Beatrice 3 times, 9 years apart each. Wow, okay. And these numbers are significant. You've got 3 being the number of the Trinity in Christianity, 9, you've got 9 being, right next to completion. And so he has this kind of, I don't know, almost mystical associations with these numbers. These are significant structural elements for him, and that he takes them to heart because of Beatrice, and he incorporates all of those into the Divine Comedy. 3 realms, 9 circles of hell, and these numbers and these structural elements keep coming up. One thing I love about the edition that I've got is there are several maps of hell inside the Inferno.
Very kind of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
exactly,
it is.
Exactly as you... And funnily enough, you could say La Vita Nuova is the Hobbit to, the Divine Comedy's Lord of the Rings, in a sense. Sets up the characters in a much more kind of modest, less dramatic way.
What I'm struggling with is how to make the connection to Star Trek. We could sit and talk about the Divine Comedy all day, but, how are these elements metaphors that are relevant to talking about Star Trek? A gate that we have to get beyond where all these terrible things are happening. The notion of a journey, being guided through the journey. On the one hand, it feels like these connections aren't very deep. On the other hand, they're so richly metaphorical for so many things in actual life and in Star Trek. I keep coming back to them because they're such good analogies for all of us in different stages of our life. They're good analogies for things we see in Star Trek. But I guess fundamentally, I can't help but ask this question, what's the big takeaway at the end of the Divine Comedy? What should the big takeaway be? And same thing with Star Trek. What's the big takeaway from all of Star Trek? And what's the big takeaway between the two? What should we take away from the Divine Comedy when we're talking about Star Trek? I struggle to get the big idea out of those things. I enjoy being on a journey through the Divine Comedy. I like the journey of Star Trek, but the philosopher in me is always so what's the point? What's the big takeaway? and that's where I struggle.
I guess you could say they are both offering kind of moral examples one way or another. I mean, Star Trek offers moral examples of, good people doing, good captains making noble decisions and kind of making things better.
Or making bad decisions sometimes.
Or making bad decisions sometimes. I know, but I mean, generally speaking, you could say Star Trek has a kind of moral core that is quite positive. Do you know what I mean? That's one of the things that people love about Star Trek. And equally, you could say the Divine Comedy, it shows the consequences of people behaving badly are awful for them. It shows, increasingly towards going into the paradiso and so on, people kind of who are more like the kind of Starfleet types who are doing their best and doing the right thing and doing noble things and self-sacrificing and so on. So you could say there's a kind of moral universe that they inhabit, that there's some kind of, link between them. I think more broadly, these themes, as you say, of going on a journey of this kind of the journey without mirroring the journey within. I mean, you get that in All Good Things, don't you? Q saying to Picard, this is not about exploring space and studying nebula and this kind of thing. This is about a kind of spiritual inward journey. You could say that's exactly what's going on for Dante. Is it really about this kind of literal journey through these realms, or is it about what is when you take from Voyager to the journey? What is the journey? Is the journey literally just from A to B, or is the journey something more significant, almost kind of spiritual, more kind of what does that represent for the people that have gone through it, and what does that experience represent for them? And I think you could say with Star Trek, actually, I mean, you're talking about this question of, is this literally happening? On what level of reality is this taking place? Well, we get that in Star Trek all the time with, holodecks, with illusions, with false memories being projected. I mean, Star Trek constantly gives us situations where people are in a situation that feels real, but may not be, or may not be entirely real, or in some cases where there's actually a sort of irresolvable ambiguity about whether that situation is real or not. I mean, if you think of something like Barge of the Dead, which has a lot of similarities, I think, to the Inferno, for obvious reasons, there's also that kind of fundamental thing that in that episode, there's no concrete answer to, did B'Elanna go to the Klingon afterlife, or did she just have a vision and imagined it all in her head? And the show will not really answer that question.
This is a fundamental problem in all of Judeo-Christian theology, I think, right? Which parts are literal? Because, people who are genuine believers think that certain things are real. God is real. Heaven's real. These are literal. These are concepts that have that and terms and vocabulary and lessons that relate to something directly. Like they point to something, they don't point to something here, but they're real, right? They're not purely allegorical, right? There's a literal component to them for people who genuinely believe. And yet certain things are clearly allegories or clearly stories or clearly metaphors or whatever. And it's like a line drawing problem, what goes in what category, which parts are literal and which parts are, just allegories or stories and not meant to be taken literally. It's hard with the Divine Comedy because Dante, he incorporates so much what I would call sort of by the book orthodoxy, Christianity into the Divine Comedy, but he's also combining all of Greek and Roman mythology into it as well, at least in the Inferno. To a lesser extent later in the Divine Comedy. But it's a really interesting question. Like, which parts did Dante mean to be taken literally given his theology, and which parts are allegorical and meant to be, interpreted psychologically or morally or otherwise? With Star Trek, it's an interesting question because Star Trek is supposed to take place in our future, a plausible, concrete future that humankind has. It has these allegorical elements, but it's a very literal interpretation of what our future could be. And I think you could say the same thing in the Divine Comedy. Dante is looking forward, halfway through life's journey going, okay, in 40 years, I'll be in the ground. What comes after? If given his theology, certain parts of the Divine Comedy are supposed to be literal, I think, right? If you literally believe in a heaven and a hell and a purgatory, if you're a good Italian Catholic of the 14th century, those are things that you believe in literally. They're not purely metaphors. And of course, I don't pretend to be a 14th century Italian and know which is supposed to be what. But I think it's not easy to tell which parts are literal and which parts are metaphorical. And it's funny you mentioned Barge of the Dead, because that's one of the obvious connections I had to make with Voyager. Like, we get an explicit vision of the Klingon afterlife in the form of Klingon hell or Barge of the Dead, the journey to hell. Just like we have a River Styx and Karen, the boatman, ferrying people over the River Styx in the Inferno. It's an explicit connection to the Divine Comedy.
And you even have those kind of monsters in the Styx, because in the Divine Comedy there are some of the people who've been, their punishment in hell is they've been turned into these kind of slimy monsters, and you have them in the Voyager episode as well. I can't remember what they call it. They're almost like the sirens, I suppose, there, but they kind of lure people off the barge and then devour them. I mean, it's very much I suppose it does feel very much more like a kind of classical vision of hell. In some ways, maybe that's what we associate with it. It struck me when you were saying that about, what do people believe? What do modern people believe? I read something once, which I thought was kind of interesting, which said when they do surveys, when they poll people and they say, do you believe in heaven or not? X number of people will say yes. And when they say, do you believe in hell or not? A very different number of people will say yes. And a lot of people will say they believe in heaven, but not hell, interestingly. And whether that's just kind of, kind of self-motivated or not, who knows? But I suppose it is interesting that that episode, it does take B'Elanna into this kind of afterlife, and it is very much realized in a similar way to that kind of quite grotesque. I mean, you do literally have the kind of gates of hell opening at one point. You could imagine them having, abandon hope all you who enter here, kind of plastered across them in Klingon almost. And
that would be awesome.
Kind of,
someone needs to translate that.
Who knows? Someone should have done that. They should have done that. Yeah, that would have been a nice kind of Easter egg for the fans. But there's also an interesting moment in that episode where there's this kind of question. There's this question mark about whether she's really gone to the afterlife or not, whether it's just a vision or not. There's also this kind of question about whether the fact that she's seen her mother there means that her mother in reality has died. And is this kind of giving B'Elanna sort of almost kind of privileged information about an aspect of reality that she's not familiar with, because obviously she's far away. She doesn't know whether her mother's alive or dead. And seeing her there, she's like, oh my God, my mother must have died, in the real world, essentially, which is the world that we're living in most of the time.
Doesn't this happen to Dante in the Divine Comedy? He comes across people that he thinks are living, but are actually in hell.
Well, this is what I was going to say. There's this very interesting connection that he inadvertently makes a man think that his son has died because the man says something about not knowing what his son's doing kind of up in the real world or whatever.
Right.
And Dante has this kind of very intense reaction and doesn't say anything. And the man deduces from this look that he gives that it must mean that his son has died. And actually what Dante is shocked by is the idea that the people in hell might not know what's happening in the real world, to the extent that if someone died, they wouldn't be down there. They wouldn't have seen them or whatever. And so it has to be sort of explained to him that actually, they aren't necessarily that aware of what's going on in the real world. So there is, again, that sort of weird link of the uncertainty of, is the person, it's a slightly different way that it plays out, but that kind of idea that there can be some uncertainty. Is someone really there or not? Is someone really dead or not? And again, in the Divine Comedy, there's also a section where they talk about people who are there in hell before they've died, because they've kind of spiritually died. And there's this weird idea that once they reach a certain kind of moral crisis point in their lives, a sort of demon will possess their body and just finish their life off for them until their allotted time is up, while their soul can kind of be, beamed down ahead of time, basically, to begin the torture in hell. So there's that weird idea, which again feels very kind of sci-fi in some ways, of these sort of body snatchers almost, isn't it? But the body is still going around, but someone else is kind of pulling the strings. And meanwhile, the person appears to be in two places at once.
I know I keep veering back towards Dante and maybe not towards Star Trek, but as I think through, again, I just wonder how intentional this kind of thing is. Like, I can imagine if you are putting myself in Dante's theology and Dante's cosmology, if you are in the Paradiso, if you're closer to having the God's eye standpoint, you're more likely to have these godlike qualities like omniscience, knowing everything going on in the physical world, right? Whereas if you're in hell, you're more removed from that. You're in a darker place. You don't have you have the opposite of a God's eye perspective. So of course, no one in hell knows what's going on in the physical world, because you don't have that kind of outside transdimensional perspective on all of physical cosmology like you would if you were in paradise.
That's a good point, yes. And we get that in Star Trek to some extent as well. We get that sense that...
the Q have that. The Q have that kind of, that omniscient, God's eye standpoint on all of physical creation, right? That's the Q are godlike in that quality. They have omniscience, and they're omnipotent, and they're transdimensional in a way. They can pop in and out of physical reality in one place and show up somewhere else. But they see all of the cosmos as a whole, I think, as I understand the Q, right? That's not what's going on in the Inferno, right? The people that are in hell in the Inferno don't have that Q-like perspective.
They don't, no. And the Q are interesting because I suppose, of course, the Q continuum, again, is a realm that can be kind of explored, and that you need a guide to explain it to you, and that can
metaphorically
kind of manifest itself. That is very allegorical, and is very kind of, there's this sort of weird question, is this literally, and they have that discussion in that episode, don't they? Is this literally the Q continuum? And they're like, no, of course not. This is just, a way of representing it to you. So again, there's that sort of idea of, the kind of allegory going on literally around you, that you can live, that an allegory isn't just something that you can read or that can be produced as a work of art, but that you can kind of experience it somehow as a reality, recognizing that it is not base reality. This
is one of the truly medieval aspects of Dante's view. If he's saying that, the closer you are to God, the more likely you are to have this God's-like perspective on thing, or what we're calling a Q-like perspective on thing in Star Trek. But, in medieval theology, you get kind of a perfect being theology where God is the most perfect being, right? And everything else that's in creation is less perfect. We have some goodness, but we're not omnibenevolent. We have some knowledge, but we're not omniscient. We have some power and ability to do things, but we're not omnipotent, right? That's an essential part of medieval philosophy and theology, a la St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, maybe St. Anselm too. I guess what I'm saying is, in order to understand those concepts, then you have to recognize that we have some understanding, but we can't have that kind of godlike omniscience, that perfect understanding that a truly divine being would have. So hence the role of metaphor and allegory. And it's just, those things are totally compatible with our sort of finite role as a created being that is, to some extent, has all the properties that God has in Christian theology, but to a lower degree, right? That notion of degrees and hierarchy is an essential part of medieval, philosophy and theology, and maybe cosmology too. And that's what's going on in that episode of Voyager, or a couple of episodes of Voyager, when we see the Q continuum. Q says, your puny little finite minds can't understand the totality of the Q continuum, so I'm presenting it to you in a way that you can understand. It's not that you can't understand it; you just have to understand it metaphorically or allegorically or some other way. But all of that strikes me as a very medieval way of thinking about human reason as it relates to the divine perspective.
Well, that is an interesting way of looking at it, for sure. And I think also this kind of theme, I suppose, of I mean, maybe Chakotay has hit on something when he talks about Dante as representing the kind of uncertainty of the Darkwood as not so much being about emotional turmoil and so on, but the idea of not seeing the path ahead and not knowing what's ahead of you. And that is certainly a theme that comes up in Star Trek again and again, is kind of, if you knew more about your future, would it affect the decisions that you make today? Which is very much what's going on in that episode, Shattered, where Janeway is kind of saying, well, if I've seen all these glimpses of the future, I'm going to avoid getting stranded in the Delta Quadrant. I'm not going to take this path. And he sort of talks her round in a way. And there's this whole element in that episode, of course, of the temporal prime directive and the idea that you can't tell people what's in their future because it might affect their decisions. Now, you could say for Dante, by writing this, committing many years to this huge work all about the afterlife, he is almost giving himself and others a glimpse at their future, because it is kind of saying, if you do this, this is what's going to come further down the line, whereas if you behave in this way, then your future is going to look very differently. So there is this kind of weird sense where, although, as I say, it's not a time travel story, there's a kind of awareness that this is, like you said, the fact that he's in this crisis because he's having this kind of midlife moment, there is a real awareness that, and certainly from our perspective, 700 years later, obviously, if those places exist, then he's in one of them, whichever one of them it might be.
When I read the Divine Comedy when I was younger, I read it largely, I think, from an emotional standpoint. I was in a dark place emotionally at some point, and the Divine Comedy spoke to me and so on. Now I kind of go, okay, I'm 40. I'm literally midway through life's journey, like Dante in the Divine Comedy. And, maybe the more literal aspects appeal to me now. What it calls to mind as you were talking? It calls to mind, I can't remember the episode name, but it's the episode of Discovery in season 2 when Pike gets a glimpse of his own future being in a wheelchair and having gone through a disaster. And he has a choice to make. He can either kind of, choose to embrace the inevitability of that and plow forward, or he can kind of tuck tail and run and try to change it. And there's a sense in which you just have to embrace your own destiny and move forward. And for me, I don't know, it sounds like super, super like naively inspirational, like just plow forward through it all, move forward in life, embrace your destiny, no matter what you're doing, just keep moving forward. And I think that's an important lesson in life. It really is. Like, I know people that have turned their back on life. They've become depressed, or they committed suicide, or fill in the blank. They've given up. They don't see possibilities. And it's a terrible place to be. That's not what you want life to be like. Life should have this forward momentum to it. And Star Trek is really consistent about this. Like, whatever danger there is, you go for it, go through it. If you have a galactic barrier, you go through it. If there's a dark unknown, we don't know what's in the nebula, we go in it anyway. And through, Star Trek is like, keep pushing forward. Don't worry about the danger. Bad things might happen along the way, but it's worth the risk to keep pushing forward. And, I don't know. Is that a naive point, or is that a really deep point? Sometimes it feels really naive and simplistic, and sometimes it feels like that's the entire point.
I think we could say plausibly that is a kind of moral avoid. I mean, you think of Captain Picard had a very well-known catchphrase, with "Make it so." Janeway, less of a catchphrase, but one of the phrases that you might associate with her is "do it." That's it, isn't it? That's what she says. She says, "Do it, do it." Yeah. All that stuff you were saying was making me think of, Nike, just do it. That's the kind of that's their slogan, isn't it? And that is basically Janeway's slogan as well. And I think you could say in some ways that does fit the kind of mood and the ethos of Voyager through those 7 years. And I guess they did do it. And, they got home in the end. They got to the end of their journey. But it is absolutely, I think that, it does sound very basic, but it is certainly one of the things that kind of is at the heart of Star Trek. You don't turn around and go home. You don't, you push forward. That's what, sitting in that chair is all about, isn't it?
But what exactly makes it worthwhile? Like, because the journey just keeps going on in Star Trek. It's not like there's an end point. Time goes on and space is endless. And
the human adventure's just beginning.
It's not teleological in the way that the Divine Comedy is, right? The Divine Comedy, teleological in the sense of having a goal or a purpose or an end point, right? For Dante, the end of the journey, not literally in the course of the Divine Comedy, but literally in the sense of in the afterlife in Christian theology. There's an end point, right? You go to paradise, and that's in some sense the goal. It's the end, right? Your journey of life and the journey of the afterlife concludes at that point, essentially, and you commune with the divine in some eternal sense that's supposed to be, eternally blissful. Star Trek isn't like that, though, right? Star Trek has this sense that there's just ongoing, endless forward momentum. There's always more unknown, always a new frontier. Space is the final frontier. There's always a new challenge to get through. But there's no real end point to it in the way that there is for the Divine Comedy.
No, I think that's right. Absolutely. Although you could say that Voyager, of all the series, you have to get home. Voyager is the show with a teleological intent, if you know what I mean, more than any of the others, insofar as that first episode sets up. And you could say, DS9 sets up an endpoint, which is Bajor is going to be admitted to the Federation, and then it never even achieves that. So, so much other stuff happens, and that you almost forget that that's what that show ostensibly was about. But Voyager absolutely sets an endpoint on day one.
Well, that turns Star Trek. Okay, again, if there's a cosmology to the Divine Comedy, there's a cosmology to Star Trek, right? Most of Star Trek says the journey is endless, right? You just keep pushing outward into the frontier. Voyager kind of turns that on its head and says the goal isn't to keep pushing forward. Paradise is being back home on Earth in what is essentially the 24th century version of paradise. I don't know. And I'm trying to think, who is the person that speaks out against this the most? Tom Paris says, "I am home, Harry," when Harry says, "I just want to get home." At some point he says, "I'm a father and a husband, and Voyager is my home. I don't need to get back home to the Alpha Quadrant to be happy or, fulfill my purpose in life. I don't really want to go home." And Harry's the one going, "We have to get home. We have to get home. We have to get home." Even Captain Janeway's like, "We have to get home. We have to get home. I'm going to get my crew home." Doesn't that just completely invert Star Trek cosmology where Earth or the Alpha Quadrant becomes the locus of creation and it's analogous to paradise in the Divine Comedy. That's backwards from most of Star Trek, I think.
It is, absolutely. It's kind of flipped on its head. But I suppose maybe you're right. Maybe the kind of moral there is that it almost doesn't matter whether they get home or not. I mean, maybe the really bold decision would have been not to send them home, in that last episode and leave them. And, who knows, 20 odd years down the line, now people would be saying, just as we're bringing back Picard, bring back Sisko, bring back, let's find out what Voyager's doing 20 years further along, I mean, that would almost have been a way of kind of solidifying that idea somehow as that is ultimately the truth that they've uncovered one way or another. But obviously at the same time, the narrative sort of requires them, for it to be satisfying as a whole, it does sort of require them to get back. And, you could say that Voyager is constrained by that structural element, which is established on day one, just the same way as these works by Dante are constrained by, the numerology or it's all, this thing has to happen exactly halfway through, and there have to be exactly this many stanzas on this side and this many stanzas on that side. And, it's all very kind of symmetrical. I mean, the Divine Comedy is these three sort of equally weighted books in a sense. It's all very...
with a pretty rigid structure within them.
It's extremely rigid structure. Yeah. And yet within that is all of this kind of very strange, mysterious, wonderful, otherworldly mystery. And, the two can exist side by side to some extent.
So I do have a couple of tidbits that I found online that are at least worth mentioning. They're just tidbits, but they're just little Dante connections inside Star Trek. Apparently, in the episode Devil's Due in TNG, a sculpture of Dante was placed in the set of A Christmas Carol when Data performed the play.
Amazing. Which makes a lot of sense.
It does, yep. Just a little nod. And also, in the shooting script for the motion picture, Spock, and I don't know if they filmed this, I couldn't figure this out or not. I don't remember it in the deleted scenes I saw, but maybe some film exists of it somewhere. Spock quotes Dante in describing what Voyager is seeking from its creator. Quote, "the divine restlessness of the human spirit," which was cut from the film. So we don't actually have that, but maybe a little clip of it exists in the archive somewhere that someone can dig up. But those are two other little Dante connections. Can you think of any other Dante connections inside Star Trek? Those are two I wasn't aware of that it was fun to find.
Well, nothing springs to mind for me necessarily, but I would be very interested if any of our listeners have anything that comes to mind for them. Oh, one other one actually, one very small one that I did love is that there's a sequence in, I guess it's in the Paradise. Anyway, it's a sequence between Dante and Beatrice where they basically play out exactly what happens in the Next Gen episode Attached, where they start realizing that they can hear each other's thoughts. And it's something to do with the spiritual connection between them. So there you go. There's my little tidbit. But I mean, there are certainly other, there are other things in there that kind of tie into Star Trek one way or another. I mean, we talked a little bit about the Garden of Eden. There's also some discussion of the River Lethe, which obviously plays into the Discovery episode of that name. I mean, I think there are lots of things that we could see, but maybe they're more just links to kind of classical mythology that are playing out in the Divine Comedy rather than anything that's kind of unique to Dante's take on it.
And that's the thing I find so interesting about the Divine Comedy. I mean, it's on the one hand, it's very orthodox in its overall structure. And on the other hand, it's also deeply intertwined with classical Greek and Roman mythology, which is pretty heretical from an Orthodox Christianity standpoint. And he's weaving all these together. And, I almost, part of me wonders how he could get away with it. And of course, maybe he wasn't. He was exiled, right? But, there's a deep orthodoxy to it, despite its incorporation of classical mythology. But I guess for me, I'm like I said, I'm 41 now, so I'm at the age Dante is supposed to be, give or take, when he wrote the Divine Comedy. Halfway through the journey, that's how I think of life up to this point. Everything up till now is part one of the journey, and for me, part two is still ahead. So I'm looking for big takeaways. Like, what's the point in the next 40 years? I'd love to hear Dante's thoughts. Like 20 years after the Divine Comedy, what does he take away from having experienced and written something like the Divine Comedy? Just like we see Captain Kirk saying, here after the 5-year mission, after he's lost the Enterprise, after all this stuff happens, he gets to get back in the saddle one more time, again and again and again throughout the Star Trek movies. And same thing with Captain Picard. He's all of TNG was part one of the journey, and now he's older, 20 years later, 25 years later, however many years it's been, saying, okay, time to get back in the saddle in some way. What is it all? And I guess there's a deeper question, like not just what do you do? Like what is part two of the journey, but like what does the first part mean, right? For me, it raises these deep questions of meaning. What's the point of everything Dante went through before he wrote the Divine Comedy? And how do you view that after the experience of the Divine Comedy, 20 years later in the second half of the journey? What's the point of everything Captain Picard did in the first half or 2/3 of his life, culminating in what we see in TNG? And what's the meaning of all of that looking back later in life? When time is, when the inevitability of time seems more clear, like, you're at the tail end looking backwards and, you've got a very finite amount of time left. And, even in the 24th century, when life is supposed to be 140 years or whatever Dr. McCoy lives to, that's not anywhere near a Q-like, godlike perspective on time. So again, no answer to that question, but because I'm right on the cusp, right like Dante was. But for me, it raises all these questions of like, what is the point of the journey in the second half of the journey?
Well, that is an interesting question. I suppose Star Trek has historically taken a lot of interest in that, and we are going to see that again with the Picard show. We are going to get a kind of second glimpse at not just Picard, but the Next Generation crew more generally to some extent. I think, unfortunately, the answer to your question, what was Dante doing 20 years after writing the Divine Comedy, is he was living it, because he died only a year after he finished it.
Oh, is that true? I guess I knew that at one point.
So that's the interesting thing, is actually he wrote it right at the very, well, I mean, I think it took a long time, but it was, I think, published about a year before he died, maybe. So it was kind of something that the product of a great period of time, but it's not like he wrote it at the age of 35. He wrote it towards the end of his life, and he didn't, unfortunately, make it to 70. I think he died, what was he, maybe about 50, something like that, which is probably not bad for that period in time. But I suppose so there is no second act in that sense, except that the story itself kind of, because, as I say, by showing us something of it shows us all of his potential futures, I suppose. If you believe in the reality of that world as depicted, he is going to end up somewhere there. And the real mystery is, what's he going to do? As Picard says in Generations, what do we do, with the time that we have, essentially? What's he going to do with the rest of his life? And where's he, when he beams down, what's the point that he's beaming down or up into going to be?
So, to me, the fact that Dante starts with the phrase midway in our life's journey, I went astray from the straight, like there's either that's a total accident, like an autobiographical, contingent, not necessary fact of his life, that halfway through life's journey, about that age is when he happened to write this and when he happened to whatever. Or there's some deeper meaning to it, like so many things in the Divine Comedy have. Is it just as simple as a midlife crisis, or is there some deeper hermeneutical meaning going on? Is it, what's the point of this taking place halfway through Dante's life's journey? And I don't know. I don't know why I keep coming to that now. Maybe it's just because I'm at that age now. But that's the passage I keep coming back to, like halfway through life's journey. This is what's happening.
And is it not halfway through our life's journey? That's how I've often seen it translated, rather than my life's journey, which sort of suggests it's not so much that it's exactly. And I suppose, to be fair, you say you feel that you're at that. I mean, I could say the same thing. We don't know. Either of us could get hit by a bus tomorrow.
Right. I could be 99.9% of the way through, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I suppose by saying halfway through our life's journey, it's kind of an assumption that there's an expectation, at least. That's what he was feeling at the time. He was in that kind of, and that's what a midlife crisis is, I suppose, isn't it? It's an expectation that you think you're probably at the halfway point. And obviously, actually, if that's the case, you're lucky in a way, because some people, that turns out not to be the case.
Actually, here we go. I have a translator's note on this notion of midway. The translator, John Ciardi, in the version I love, says, midway in our life's journey, the biblical lifespan is 70 years and 10. The action opens in Dante's 35th year, or AD 1300. There we go.
Well, whatever the answer to that question, I suppose Dante didn't have the benefit of, someone breaking the temporal prime directive to tell him exactly how long he was going to live, whether they'd be willing to or not. But we are most certainly more than midway through our podcast journey. In fact, I think we've pretty much reached the apotheosis of this conversation. We're in paradise, as it were. So before we go, Zachary, do you want to let our listeners know where they can find you elsewhere on the Trek FM network, and if they want to contact you on social media, what's the best way to find you there as well?
Absolutely. You can find me hosting 2 podcasts on the Trek FM network. One is To the Journey, Trek FM show dedicated to Star Trek Voyager. And you can also find me on Metatreks, a show dedicated to Star Trek and philosophy. Because in another time frame, another part of my life, first part of the journey, I was a philosophy teacher. Interestingly enough, I am again, Duncan, by the way. I'm teaching philosophy again. I don't know if you had seen that on social media or not.
There you go. It's come full circle.
So my students get to hear about all this stuff, Dante and philosophy included, and Star Trek from time to time. If you want to find me on Twitter, you can find me there. My handle is just my name, at Zachary Fruhling. It's Zachary, Zachary, Fruhling, Fruhling.
Well, thank you, Zachary, so much for joining me once again. It's been great having you back on the show. And as I say, great to have you as a guide to this rather complex world of Dante and his remarkable works, and to take a look at how they relate to Star Trek.
Well, have me back again, and we will take the conversation even deeper, hopefully not into a deeper circle of hell.
That's at least to be hoped for. But the circles of hell are not the only thing that we've been talking about on Trek FM this week. So here's a listen to what else you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Literary Treks.
I knew from the beginning it was going to be a very large and complicated undertaking. I was asked by the editor and the licensor to come up with a storyline for Picard that would deal with the fallout of what I unleashed in my novel Section 31 Control, in which Section 31's crimes, and in fact its very existence, are publicly exposed to the Federation at large, as well as its interstellar neighbors.
Earl Grey.
Troy looks down at her empty stomach.
Let me do this part. I'm going to act it.
Okay. Troy looks down at her empty stomach and frowns telepathically.
Oh, I wish.
Listeners, you couldn't see it, but I did that.
Oh, okay.
LaForge. Computer, locate a big thing of chips. To the journey!
What about the Basics planet?
That planet's not bad. There's a lot of wide open spaces. You just have to avoid going in the caves.
Yeah. I mean, anthropologically speaking.
No spelunking on that planet. You can spelunk on the Borg Una complex, but you can't spelunk on that planet.
No.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
That he said...
He was taking the new body out for a ride?
Yeah, that was great.
I mean, it was a great line. It just doesn't really fit what really happened. Like, he wasn't out there dating other people, you know? Like,
well, he was trying to figure out who this new Culber was, you know?
No, I know, but
it was funny. It was lighthearted.
Right. It just doesn't fit what he actually did.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture, and that will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you can find all our details at patreon.com/TrekFM. We'd like to take a moment now to thank our associate producers on Primitive Culture, Amy Nelson, Clara Cook, and Tony Black. Amy is a presenter of many other shows on the network, and you can find her on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson. Clara and Tony were two of the former co-hosts of this show, and they'll be popping back from time to time. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC, and Tony at AJ Black Writer.
You're blended, all right.